All right. All right. Hi, my name is Soyoung L Kim, and I am a visual artist and sometimes a writer. and uh, see, I'm a daughter, a sister, a wife, and mother, and um, and just a curious human being.
Well, I'm very excited to start our chat today. I want to start the conversation with the same question I start every interview with, but this one I'm very excited for your answer. Are you hood grown, and if so, how does that influence your aesthetic?
Yeah. I was thinking about this one and hood grown, and I think for me, my hood is gonna straddle several different locations.
Mm-hmm.
So I was born in Korea, in Seoul, and then when I was 6 years old, my family relocated to Nairobi, Kenya, and so I spent most of my childhood in Nairobi, and um, and then even within Nairobi, my parents sent me to a British school. And so, even within the Kenyan culture, I was sort of then thrown into this whole other culture
Mm-hmm.
of the British. And so, as a kid, I felt like I was straddling all these different worlds. My parents, who in some ways were kind of stuck back in an old Korea that doesn't exist anymore, and trying to maintain Korean culture in the household. And so I grew up speaking Korean to my parents, but then at school, I'd be in this very British environment, learning British history, and sort of feeling a bit lost. Well, how does this fit in for me? And then on the streets, sort of as the Kenyan culture, which, and so I felt in some ways that I didn't belong in any of these places, and I was this kind of skirting the boundaries of all of these, and yet straddling, entering in, coming out, and so how has that affected my aesthetic? I think, in some ways, a lack of possession, perhaps on my part, of feeling like, do I really belong in any of these places? And my home is in some ways sort of straddling multiple places and walking this line along these boundaries
Mm-hmm.
that I've had to sort of cross over into. Um, and so my artistic aesthetics, I feel like, there's a certain appreciation of color, and we can talk more about that further on. But definitely certain colors influence me and my work, and I think that has been fed by sort of the environment I grew up in, Nairobi, certainly. Um, and then in terms of sort of creating worlds in my art that um, don't really exist. And so I tend to be drawn to abstraction and maybe even surrealism earlier on in my work, because in some ways, I had to create a world sort of outside of the worlds that I was straddling to
Mm-hmm.
feel at home. And so that, I think, so that's how my work has been influenced. Yeah.
No, that's beautiful. That's a great way of like diving into it. I think that's awesome. To go a little bit off of the art talk for a second,
Mm-hmm.
I just want to ask, like, how are you feeling? How are you coping? How are you caring for yourself right now? I do like to do a little check-in with our guests because this year is crazy.
Yes.
How are you dealing with it? Has your art been impacted? How have you been impacted? And how are you coping through it all?
Yeah. I think, like for everyone, 2020 was just just horrific. And I think emotionally, at first I felt like I had to work through a lot of anger and anxiety too. And, but I think at this point of the year, probably because 2020 is wrapping up, we're looking forward to a new president.
Yes, that will definitely be a big change we all need.
Right. I think, and sort of, I love sort of this time of the year in that we can look back on the year and sort of feel like, wow, we survived, we really survived. And at the end of the day, I think I'm just grateful for, the basic things like food on the table, roof over my head, and being able to keep working. I know so many people have lost jobs and are struggling to just meet those basic needs. So in that way, I'm very grateful. And I think there were many days where I felt like, oh my gosh, I just don't know if I can keep working or making anything. But at the same time, looking back now, I realize, oh, I have created, I have, accomplished some things despite everything. They may not be projects that I was intending, but nevertheless, I have kept creating. And so that's important. And that is something I'm thankful for. Yeah.
Awesome. So now we can jump into the art talk.
Okay.
So I want to start by saying I think I could talk to you about materials all day. I was very sad that I wasn't able to see your show at Simmons because of the pandemic that we're living through. But I was very hyped to see your installation work. I got to see your collaboration installation work with Stephen Hamilton back at we were talking right before the interview started last year, which is crazy to think about that it was last year. And your work with not only paint and your 2D materials are beautiful. You play with layers and materials so much. But how do you choose materials for your work? Do materials inform the work? And are you a collector? Are you an upcycler? How do you go about your just material process with your 2D and your 3D work?
Yeah. So I think the sort of the upcycling goes back to my childhood in Nairobi. I grew up seeing kids in the slums, digging through garbage piles because, the garbage would pile up, and a lot of them, being kids, would be rummaging through, finding materials that they would need, and then build their toys out of those materials. I often talk about, cars that they would build by hammering down cans, metal cans, and then even balls, by taking plastic bags and then, wrapping twine around it. And so, and even for our family, I think when you live in an environment where, there isn't so much excess, of material, you sort of get used to the habit of recycling stuff. You repurpose things constantly. And so I think that was ingrained in me as I was growing up. And so for a time I was writing a lot, and I'd accumulate these stacks of manuscript paper that I had printed out. And it was like, well, I didn't exactly want to throw them out, right? And then also I think there's this sort of attachment thing where surely I can repurpose this and make something out of it. And so that's where the paper mache sort of began. And I began to think about, well, what can I make by repurposing paper? And then sort of also, all the words on it, they can be used as additional layer to create texture, and depth. And so that's how that began. And so the particular installation slash mural thing at Simmons was my first sort of experiment in trying to combine all the painting and the sculpture work as well as the writing, because I was using all three of those forms in that space, and trying to figure out what I could do with that. Yeah. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, the photos turned out beautiful. I wish I was able to experience it. It is on your website still, so I will make sure people have that link so they can check it out. I was because I love that space. It's a great space to install in, and too bad for all this.
Yeah.
This year. You mentioned a little bit about your relationship to texture, but can you describe your relationship to texture and color in your, not only your paintings, but your sculpture and your installations? Because you kind of have like three different ways of kind of working, but I definitely see an overlap through the different spaces that you're creating.
Yeah. I think texture and color are sort of my language, right? My building blocks. And so because my work isn't necessarily representational, I feel like I use a lot of texture and color to communicate sort of emotion and depth. And so now with the sculpture work, I tend to, because it seems so much about texture, I mute the colors a lot and so try to leave that out. Whereas in my my painting work, the two-dimensional work, the color, I'm going to be layering a lot of different colors to create depth and texture. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think in my work, in both the sculpture and the painting, I am primarily interested in creating depth, because in some ways this is a world that I want you to enter into with me, and so it's very much steeped in nature and landscape as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can definitely feel like it is obviously abstract work we're talking about here, but I definitely always feel like there is some kind of connection to either the sky or the land or some kind of extension to nature. But there's also like this contrast you have in a lot of your work when you use like the dark grays and blues. They feel something kind of almost industrial about them. And then you have you use a lot of bright oranges, which I love orange. In those colors, like the contrast is always so beautiful, but there is that reminiscence of nature, but then there's like something that kind of, I don't know, wants to combat it in some way through your layers. So I definitely think it's feeding everything that you're talking about. The work is beautiful.
Yeah. Well, I think, because I feel like I've had to enter into cross over so many human-made boundaries. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times I look at nature and sort of, nature continues to go about her thing, whether civilizations come and go. And yet we, I think, have somehow this belief that we own land, we own property, we own this space. But do we really? We try. I think we try. And so, yeah, I think for me, it's looking at landscape as, kind of, there's all this chaos here that I'm feeling of straddling all these different places, different people. But I can look beyond and sort of see that, oh, well, you know, there's something greater here than us. Yeah.
Yeah. So you talk a little bit about your, there seems to be some kind of overlap between the ways that you're working in these different kinds of mediums and these different kind of spaces, from sculpture, painting to installation. Do you have an overlapping technique that you use making two-dimensional, three-dimensional work? Is there anything that feels similar in the making, in the creation of the work? Obviously, the actual materials are different, but is there anything that you're doing physically that feels similar, or maybe the way you approach the work that feels similar?
Yeah. I think the two feel different to me. And I think what I like about the two different processes is that I can go back and forth. And so the sculpture work feeds something that the painting wouldn't feed. So with the sculptural work, it's a lot of sort of these small movements, you know, me sitting at the table and like creating the sculpture. And it's a lot of repetitive movements, kind of monotonous. And
I know, as a sculptor myself, I totally know that there's a lot of tedious work that goes in with sculpture. You're just like, all right, I have to do this over and over again, maybe 120 times. Let's just lock into it.
Right. And so, you know, it's almost, there's some therapeuticness about it. Because it's a lot of mindless movement in some ways, you know. And there are times when I crave that. But with the painting, I think, especially on like, if it's a mural or a large canvas, you know, it's going to require much bigger movements on my part. And then also with painting, especially with the watercolor, I'm going to be doing a lot of pre-work, sort of practicing, not only to get the colors right, but sort of the movements and the brushstrokes right before I do the final piece, so that when I go to do the final work, my movements feel natural and more fluid. So there's, you know, very different way of working, I think. Yeah.
To compare another kind of two other things that you do, but you mentioned just now that you work a lot with watercolor and working on watercolor paper, which I love. Your smaller pieces, I think they're gorgeous. But how do you just mentioned that you practice when you do these small watercolor paintings, which is so interesting to me because, yeah, watercolor is not forgiving the same way that it is like with sculpture or acrylic paint. You can kind of cover things up. Like with watercolor, it's very like, try to hide that mistake, try your best, but you really can't. But how is that versus like an installation when you are making not only like a large mural, but something that maybe has a lot of layers to it? And how do they compare?
I think they're both similar in that there is a lot of pre-work, you know. So like I said, with the watercolor, I do a lot of sketching beforehand, you know, and I actually recently completed a commission where I sent the photo of a finished piece to the collector, and then I looked at it again. I was like, God, I am not happy with this. And so I told him, wait, you know, I'm gonna do a second round. And I was much happier with the second round. And so, you know, there's watercolor is just sort of, you got to get it the first time around.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of prep work for that. And then with the installation, um, you know, I'm envisioning that space in my head, and some sketching, you know, but a lot of it is looking and kind of in my head, of course, imagining it in my head and say where all of this goes, and trying to get that all figured out before I go to install. So that's the prep work right there.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. So we talked a little bit about your work with layers. How do you use layers when it comes to different materials and different mediums?
Yeah, that's so with the sculptures, I can talk about a collaboration I did at the Boston Center for the Arts when I did a residency with a choreographer. And so we were collaborating on a dance piece. And so we used my art to do projections and also the sculptures to attach to like the dancers, or they use some of the sculptures in their choreography. And so with that, the layering happened with, in some ways, the lighting and then the movement, and actually moving the sculptures created, you know, visual, I guess, an interesting visual, like changes and shifts that you can't get on like two-dimensional work, right? And so I do feel like with the sculptural work, I enjoy sort of the of movement being included with that, rather than it being the static piece that doesn't move. And then with my paintings, I think I try to create movement within the piece through composition and layering, and then just how the paint is applied, right? Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this is my last like real question for you. Other than the last like little slide questions we have at the very end. So reading your bio, of course, I did that quite a long time ago when I featured your work on the show months ago. But I always was really drawn to, like, I think it's your first couple lines that you say that your work is powered by your emotions and informed by your emotions. How has your work been impacted by this year, this 2020? And do you anticipate your work having a shift in 2021?
Yeah, I think so. Looking back on this year, you know, I think when everything sort of folded, it was sort of hard to get back into the work on some days, right? But at the same time, I did have certain projects that began before pandemic and that carried me through. And so so I did appreciate those projects, because they kind of forced me to keep working regardless of how I was feeling. But at the same time, I think just all the unrest and all the anger sort of helped me channel my work into those areas, you know. And so two of the projects that I did in the last few months were for, you know, donations to raise funds for various organizations. You know, one was for voting registration work, and then another was for RIA House, which they're an organization that works with women who are trying to get out of the sex traffic industry. And so I think my work this past year has has, I think it has always been about, exploring these human boundaries that we create and how we can overcome those. But I think it's become more pointedly that way this year. And sort of, I think, using my art more to be generous than in probably years past, I hope. In terms of looking forward to 2021, there are definitely new projects that I have in mind. And I don't think I can talk too freely about them because it's still in the works. And I think there are some projects that are definitely going to be collaborative. But, I would love to sort of think about, how we today in America, I think we're sort of looking at the whole umbrella of POC. What does that mean? BIPOC. What does that mean? And sort of, can we all come together and work together despite all our differences? Because there are so many of us, and we all come from such different backgrounds, and we all have such varied stories. And can we find a common footing and be united? Yeah.
Fight white supremacy.
Right. Yeah, and so that is something that I'm looking to explore in the coming years, and sort of trying to find projects and creating projects where we can explore that more. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Soyoung, for sharing so much with me. I really appreciate it. The last thing I'm going to ask is, where can the people find you? Where can they find your work? Obviously not physically. We don't want any close contact, but how can they find your work and get in touch with you?
Yeah. So I think the easiest way to find me is on Instagram at Soyoung L Kim. And there I'll be usually posting a lot of not only finished work, but process as well. And so that's sort of a more, I guess, intimate day-to-day look at my work. And then, my website, soyounglkim.com, is more like a portfolio where you'll get to see a lot of.
We love branding, streamlining names, very easy to find. But we will put all that in the show notes too, so it'll be very easy to find you, along with lots of beautiful images of your work. So thank you so much for taking time and speaking with me this morning. And I hope you have a great rest of the year. Even though there's only less than a week left, I hope you survive it.
Yes, thank you so much. This is so great. Yeah.